Welcome to Stories of Slumber, a quiet place where history softens and the ancient world returns in gentle whispers. Today, let us get into the story of the Sumerians, the first civilization in human history, probably. There is a clay tablet, no larger than a human hand, resting behind glass in a museum somewhere between London and Baghdad. Its surface bears strange wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud that hardened 5,000 years ago. The marks tell a story, not of kings or conquests, but of beer, a recipe, instructions for brewing, a transaction recorded, someone counting barley, someone measuring out wages in bread and ale. This is where writing begins, not with prayers or proclamations, but with the ordinary needs of people trying to remember who owed what to whom. The tablet is Sumerian, and if you trace every alphabet, every language, every written word back far enough, you arrive here, in the space between two rivers, in a land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the place where civilization first opened its eyes and began to dream. But what does it mean to be first? And why did it happen there, in the flat mud plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, where nothing grows without human hands to guide the water? Why not in the mountains, where springs run clear? Why not along the coasts, where the sea offers easy passage? What invisible current pulled humanity towards that specific stretch of earth and whispered the first words of a new kind of existence? The land remembers differently than people do. In southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers slow and spread before reaching the Persian Gulf, the earth rises in strange mounds. Locals call them tells, hills that don't belong, too regular, too purposeful. For centuries, these mounds gathered dust, sheltered goats, marked boundaries between farms. Beneath them, entire cities slept. When archaeologists first began digging in the mid-1800s, they expected to find Babylon. They expected Assyria, the great empires mentioned in biblical texts. What they found instead was older, deeper, written in a language no one could read, describing kings no chronicle remembered, worshipping gods whose names had vanished from every living tradition. The texts they found spoke of a place called Sumer, a people who called themselves the Black-Headed Ones. And as translation slowly, painfully gave up its secrets, a stunning realization took hold. These people had been first, not just early, first. Before Egypt raised its pyramids, Sumer had cities. Before the Indus Valley cultivated its great urban centres, Sumer had written law. Before anyone else carved a wheel, Sumer was moving goods on them. Before any known civilization organised time, Sumer had divided the day into 24 hours, the hour into 60 minutes, the circle into 360 degrees. Why did it happen there? Why did civilization, that peculiar human experiment of living together in vast numbers under shared rules, begin in that particular stretch of river valley? The answer starts with water and with a problem. Mesopotamia means between rivers. The Greeks gave it that name much later, but the geography defined everything. The Tigris and Euphrates descend from the mountains of Anatolia and Armenia, gathering winter snow and spring rains, then flood across the flatlands of what is now southern Iraq. The floods are unpredictable, violent, transformative. Unlike the Nile, which floods with reassuring regularity, the Mesopotamian rivers change course, overflow without warning, destroy as often as they nourish. The land itself is unforgiving. No stone for building, few trees, summer heat that bakes earth into cracked pottery. And yet between those floods, when the water recedes and leaves its gift of silt, the soil becomes almost supernaturally fertile. This was the Sumerians' inheritance, a land that offered everything and nothing, that promised abundance and threatened catastrophe in the same season. To survive here required something humanity had never quite managed before. It required cooperation on a massive scale. One family can dig a small irrigation channel, a village can manage a reservoir, but to tame the rivers, to distribute water across miles of farmland, to build levees that hold back floods and canals that carry water to thirsty fields, you need hundreds of people working in coordination. You need planning. You need organisation. You need someone to decide who gets water when, who digs where, who maintains what. You need, in other words, civilization. Around 5000 BCE, something shifted. Small farming communities that had dotted the river valleys for millennia began to cluster. They grew larger, more permanent. By 4500 BCE, settlements like Eridu showed signs of something new, temple complexes. Not just shrines, but buildings that dominated the landscape, that required resources, labour, expertise to construct. Why temples? Why would early people, struggling to farm and survive, pour energy into religious architecture? The answer may lie in the challenge itself. In a land where survival depended on coordinated effort, where the rivers could give or destroy on a whim, religion became the organising principle. The temples were not just places of worship. They were administrative centres, storehouses, hubs of economic distribution. The priests who served the gods also managed the irrigation systems, collected surplus grain, organised labour, kept records. The gods needed servants. The servants needed organisation. Organisation needed records. And records needed writing. By 3500 BCE, in the city of Uruk, someone pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and created the first written symbols. They were not letters, not quite pictures. They were marks representing things: grain, sheep, beer, labour. Accounting, essentially, the bureaucracy of survival. But something extraordinary happens when thought becomes visible. When you can store information outside your own memory, you can build on it, refine it, share it across distances and time. Writing did not just record what the Sumerians knew, it allowed them to know more. Within centuries, the symbols evolved. They became cuneiform, wedge-shaped, capable of expressing not just objects, but ideas, sounds, grammar, story. The Sumerians began to write everything: temple receipts, legal contracts, medical texts, mathematical problems, letters, proverbs, myths. They wrote a poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh, about a king who could not accept death and wandered to the edge of the world seeking immortality. They wrote instructions for exorcising demons. They wrote insults. One tablet records a customer complaint about a copper delivery, calling the merchant dishonest and demanding better quality goods. The voice across 4,000 years is instantly recognisable, human, frustrated, real. The city of Uruk, where writing was born, grew into something the world had never seen. By 3000 BCE, it sprawled across 250 hectares. Its walls stretched 9 kilometres. 40,000 people lived within its bounds, maybe more. For perspective, that population density would not be matched in Europe for another 3,000 years. What does a city that size require? Everything. Food brought from distant farms, water systems, waste management, security, trade networks, social hierarchy, law. 40,000 people cannot organise themselves through kinship and tradition alone. There are too many strangers, too many competing needs. The Sumerians developed solutions. They created the Lugal, the big man, a king whose authority came from both divine mandate and practical necessity. They built ziggurats, massive step temples that dominated the skyline, asserting order against the flat chaos of the river plain. The ziggurat at Uruk, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, rose on a platform 12 metres high. Climbing its stairs, a priest or supplicant would have looked out over rooftops, canals, fields stretching to the horizon, a view that said, "We have mastered this, but cities need more than symbols. They need food." And Sumer faced a fundamental problem. The land was fertile but limited. The rivers watered crops, but the rivers also brought salt. Irrigation, year after year, deposits salt in the soil. Over time, fields that grew barley struggle. Eventually they fail. The Sumerians were trapped by their own success. The agricultural surplus that made cities possible also poisoned the earth. They adapted. They switched from wheat, which is salt sensitive, to barley, which tolerates it better. They left fields fallow. They dug deeper canals to flush salt away. But the problem never fully disappeared. It haunted them. Meanwhile, the cities multiplied. Uruk was not alone. Rose near the river mouths, a maritime power that traded with distant lands. Lagash flourished inland, its temples wealthy, its borders contested. Nippur became the religious heart, home to Enlil, king of the gods, a neutral city where rival states sent offerings and sought legitimacy. Each city was independent. Each had its own king, its own patron deity, its own interests. They traded with each other, they married their royal children to each other, and they fought each other constantly, over water rights, over fields, over honour. War became part of the Sumerian rhythm. Not the total wars of annihilation that later empires would wage, but limited conflicts over specific grievances. A king would muster his army, farmers and craftsmen mostly, led by a small corps of professional soldiers, and march against a neighbouring city. Battles were brief, brutal, settled by mace and spear. The victorious king would loot the losing city's temple, install a puppet ruler, extract tribute, then return home to dedicate the spoils to his own gods. One stele carved in limestone and erected by the tomb of Lagash around 2450 BCE depicts such a war. The stele of the vultures shows soldiers marching in formation, their shields locked, spears levelled. Above them, the god Ningirsu holds a net filled with enemy corpses. Below, vultures pick at the dead. The inscription describes a border dispute with the city of Umma. Enatum claims divine right, describes his victory, warns Umma never to violate the boundary again. It is propaganda, certainly. But it is also history, the first detailed account of a military campaign, complete with justification, tactics, and outcome. And woven through the text is something else, a sense that war, for all its necessity, is tragedy. The Sumerians celebrated their victories but also mourned the cost. Their literature returns again and again to the theme of destruction. Cities burned, fields left empty, widows weeping, the price of order. One man tried to change the equation. His name was Urukagina, and he ruled Lagash around 2350 BCE. He is remembered because he did something revolutionary. He reformed the system. Lagash, like other Sumerian cities, had grown corrupt. Priests controlled vast estates. Officials extracted excessive taxes. The poor were exploited. Widows and orphans had no protection. Urukagina looked at this and decided it was wrong. He issued a series of reforms, inscribed on clay, that reduced taxes, limited the power of priests, protected the vulnerable. He called it restoring justice. He claimed he was returning to the old ways, to a time when the god's will was properly honoured. Whether such a golden age ever existed is doubtful. But Urukagina's reforms represent something genuinely new. The idea that power has limits, that rulers have obligations, that the weak deserve protection. It is, arguably, the world's first written law code, predating Hammurabi by 500 years, a radical assertion that might does not make right. Urukagina's reign lasted 7 years. Then Lugal-Zaggisi, king of Umma, conquered Lagash, destroyed its temples, burned its records. Urukagina vanished from history. His reforms died with him, but the idea survived, carved into clay, copied by scribes, preserved in temple archives. Future kings read his words. Some even claimed to follow his example. The notion that law should restrain power, that justice mattered, had been planted. It would grow. Lugal-Zaggisi did not enjoy his victory long. He conquered most of Sumer, proclaimed himself king of the land, ruled from Uruk with grandiose titles. Then around 2334 BCE, a new force arrived from the north. His name was Sargon. He was not Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language foreign to the river cities. His origin story, recorded on later tablets, claims he was born in secret, placed in a reed basket, floated down the river, rescued and raised by a gardener. The details echo other heroic myths. They may be invention, but Sargon himself was real. He began as a cupbearer to a king. Through ambition, skill, or treachery, the records are unclear, he seized power. He built a new capital, Akkad, whose location remains unknown, and then he set about conquering everything in reach. Sargon smashed Lugal-Zaggisi's army, paraded him in a neckstock before the gods. He conquered the Sumerian cities one by one. He marched west to the Mediterranean, north to Anatolia, east to Elam. He claimed to have washed his weapons in the Persian Gulf and the Upper Sea. He built the world's first empire. For the Sumerians, this was catastrophe and transformation. Their independence ended, their cities became provinces. A foreign dynasty ruled from a foreign capital, imposed foreign officials, demanded tribute. And yet Sargon did something unexpected. He embraced Sumerian culture. He learned cuneiform. He honoured Sumerian gods. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. Enheduanna was a poet. Her hymns, written in Sumerian, are among the earliest signed literary works in history. She wrote with elegance and power, praising the goddess Inanna, describing her own struggles, asserting her authority. In one composition, she describes being exiled from the temple by a rebel, crying out to Inanna for rescue. The goddess answers. Enheduanna returns. Order is restored. It is theology, but it is also autobiography. The first writer in history whose personality we can glimpse through their words. Sargon's dynasty, the Akkadian Empire, lasted about 2 centuries. His grandson Naram-Sin pushed the borders even further, declared himself a god, had his statue carved with horns of divinity. But empires built on conquest crack under their own weight. Rebellions flared. Invaders pressed the borders. Climate shifted. Drought struck. Around 2150 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Suddenly. Completely. Cities were abandoned. Trade networks failed. In the vacuum, the Sumerian cities reasserted themselves. For a brief, brilliant moment, they bloomed again. This period, called the Ur-3 dynasty, saw the city of Ur rise to dominate Sumer. King Ur-Nammu took power around 2047 BCE and did something Urukagina had dreamed of. He created a comprehensive law code. Not just reforms, but a systematic legal framework covering everything from property disputes to personal injury to family law. The code establishes fines rather than harsh physical punishments for many offences. It protects the poor from exploitation. It regulates marriage and inheritance. It is not perfect by modern standards. Women and slaves have limited rights. Punishments vary by social class, but it represents a profound step toward legal order. Justice made explicit. Written down, binding on everyone, even the king. Ur-Nammu also rebuilt. He constructed ziggurats across Sumer, including the great ziggurat of Ur, which still stands, partially reconstructed, its mud brick bulk rising from the desert. He organised the irrigation systems, standardised weights and measures, promoted trade. Under his rule and his sons, Sumer achieved a kind of golden age, but it was a fragile gold. The Ur-3 state was hyper-organised, perhaps too organised. Thousands of clay tablets from this period record minute details of economic life. How many sheep a herdsman managed, how much grain a field produced, how many days a worker laboured on a canal. The bureaucracy tracked everything. This level of control required resources, labour, food. When drought returned, when harvests failed, when trade disrupted, the system could not flex. It shattered. Around 2004 BCE, Elamite invaders from the east sacked Ur. They destroyed the city, carried away its last king in chains. Sumerian poets wrote lamentations, mournful songs describing temples in ruins, streets empty, gods departed. The lamentation for Ur describes the goddess Ningal weeping for her city, unable to prevent its destruction. The poem ends with hope for rebuilding. But that rebuilding would not be Sumerian. New peoples moved into Mesopotamia, Amorites from the west, Elamites from the east. They adopted Cuneiform, worshipped the old gods, built on Sumerian foundations. But the Sumerian language slowly faded from daily use, becoming a language of scholarship, of religion like Latin in medieval Europe. By 1800 BCE, no one spoke Sumerian as their mother tongue anymore. The black-headed people who had built the first cities, written the first laws, told the first stories, had vanished into the cultures they had created. Or had they? Because this is where the story becomes strange. The Sumerians disappeared, but almost nothing they invented did. Their cuneiform script was adapted by Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, Persians. It remained the dominant writing system of the Near East for 3,000 years. Their mathematical system, based on the number 60, gave us the 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle. We still use them. Their legal concepts influenced Hammurabi's famous code, which in turn influenced biblical law, which influenced Western legal tradition. Their myths, especially the flood story, were retold by later cultures, found their way into religious texts still read today. The wheel they invented rolled into every corner of the earth. The plough they designed still turns soil. The urban model they created, the city as a centre of trade, administration, religion, culture, remains our default pattern of settlement. Most profoundly, they established the idea that civilization is something built, not given. That humans can shape their environment, organise their societies, record their knowledge, improve their condition. They faced a harsh land and made it bloom. They faced chaos and imposed order. They faced forgetting and created memory. And then they themselves were forgotten. For over 2,000 years, the Sumerians existed only as anonymous builders of tells in the desert. Their language, once the tongue of science and literature, survived only in copied texts that later scribes could barely read. Their cities were mounds of earth. Their gods were nameless. Their achievements attributed to others. Why does forgetting happen? How does an entire civilization vanish from human memory? Part of it is the nature of Mesopotamian geography. No great monuments of stone survive to spark curiosity, like Egypt's pyramids. Mud brick returns to earth. Rivers change course, burying cities under silt. The region suffered invasion after invasion. Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, each wave bringing new languages, new religions, new stories. The continuity broke. But part of it is also the nature of influence. The Sumerians succeeded too well. Their inventions became universal. When everyone uses cuneiform, no one remembers who invented it. When every culture tells flood myths, the original source blurs. The Sumerians dissolved into the foundation of civilization. Invisible because they were everywhere, it took modern archaeology to resurrect them. When Henry Rawlinson decoded cuneiform in the 1850s, when Leonard Woolley excavated in the 1920s, when Samuel Noah Kramer pieced together Sumerian literature in the mid-1900s, a lost world returned. And what a world! The tablets tell stories, not just of kings and battles, but of ordinary life. A father writes advice to his son about the importance of education. A wife complains about her husband's family. Students copy practice texts, making the same spelling errors ancient teachers corrected. A tavern keeper waters down her beer and faces punishment. A scribe boasts about his skills. One tablet records a collection of proverbs. Some are practical. Do not buy a donkey that brays too much. Some are cynical. The poor man is better dead than alive. Some are philosophical. Friendship lasts a day, kinship lasts forever. And some are darkly funny. I'm about to die, but the barley is growing beautifully. These are not primitive people fumbling towards civilization. These are people like us, worried about money, frustrated by bureaucracy, trying to raise their children well, seeking meaning, facing mortality. The concerns have not changed, only the medium has. In their literature, the Sumerians obsessed over certain themes, mortality especially. The Epic of Gilgamesh, their greatest story, is essentially about the terror of death and the futility of trying to escape it. Gilgamesh is powerful, part divine, the greatest king Uruk ever knew. He builds the Great Wall. He defeats monsters. He is unstoppable. Then his friend Enkidu dies. And Gilgamesh realizes that death comes for everyone. All his strength means nothing. So he journeys to the edge of the world, crosses the waters of death, finds the one man who survived the Great Flood and was granted immortality. He asks for the secret. The answer is disappointing. There is no secret. The immortal man, Utnapishtim, gained eternal life through a unique circumstance that cannot be repeated. He gives Gilgamesh a plant that restores youth, but a snake steals it while Gilgamesh bathes. The king returns home empty-handed. The story ends not with triumph but with acceptance. Gilgamesh looks at the walls of Uruk, the city he built. That is his immortality. Not life without end, but work that outlasts the worker. Legacy. It is a profoundly mature conclusion. One that suggests the Sumerians understood what they were building. Not just cities and canals, but something that would persist. Culture, memory, civilization. And they were right. When Earth fell, when the language died, when the last Sumerian speaker was buried and forgotten, the work remained. Every culture that followed built on what they had created. The Babylonians inherited their cities. The Assyrians used their legal concepts. The Persians administered their empire using Sumerian-derived systems. The Greeks learned their mathematics. The Arabs transmitted their astronomical knowledge to medieval Europe. The chain never broke. It just changed hands. There is a question archaeologists and historians still debate. Why here? Why then? Other regions had rivers, other people farmed. The Nile Valley had better conditions, arguably. Yet Egypt's civilization appeared slightly later. China's first cities came more than 1,000 years after Sumer's. The Indus Valley was contemporary, but developed somewhat independently. What made Mesopotamia the first? Perhaps it was exactly the challenge. The unpredictable floods, the lack of resources, the need for cooperation on a scale that forced innovation. Perhaps desperation mothers invention better than comfort does. Or perhaps it was contingency. The right people, the right moment, the right circumstances aligning in a way that history rarely repeats. A handful of villages deciding to build temples. A clever scribe realizing marks in clay could record information. A king choosing justice over exploitation. A priest writing poems that lasted millennia. History is not inevitable. It is choices. And the Sumerians made choices that echo still. They chose cities over villages, knowing cities were harder. They chose writing over memory, changing how humans think. They chose law over custom, constraining power. They chose to build in mud brick, knowing it would not last because mud brick was what they had. They chose to worship gods who demanded justice, not just sacrifice. They chose to tell stories about mortality, not immortality. And in choosing these things, they became the first. Not because they were inherently special, but because they faced their reality and responded with creativity, organization, and determination. The sun rises over the ruins of Uruk. Sand fills the streets where thousands once walked. The ziggurat is a mound now, shapeless, eroded. Wind moves through gaps in ancient walls. No one speaks Sumerian. No one worships Inanna. The black-headed people are dust. But dig down through the sand, find the layer 4,000 years old, brush away the dirt. There, pressed into clay, is writing. An invoice, a poem, a prayer, a student's practice tablet with a teacher's corrections in the margin, a king's proclamation, a widow's complaint to a judge. The voices are still there, waiting, speaking across impossible distance. This is what the Sumerians left us. Not immortality, not escape from time, but the ability to speak to the future, to record what we know, to preserve what we value, to build something that outlasts our brief years. They invented civilization, and civilization is, at its core, a conversation across generations. The dead teaching the living, the present shaping the future. Knowledge accumulated, refined, passed on. We are part of that conversation. Every time we write something down, every time we organise for the common good, every time we create something meant to last, every time we tell a story about who we were and who we hope to become. The Sumerians started talking 5,000 years ago. We are still listening, and perhaps in some library of the far future, when our own languages are dead and our cities are dust, someone will find our words pressed into whatever medium we use. They will translate. They will read. They will wonder who we were. And the conversation will continue. The rivers flow as they always have, carrying silt and salt and possibility. The land waits, and somewhere in the earth, another tablet sleeps. Another story waits to be told. Another voice waits to be heard. The first civilization spoke. The echo never ends.